So you'll ask me, but isn't religion about truth? Aren't we looking for truth? So the answer is yes, and also no. There are different kinds of truth. So the philosopher Ludwig Wittgenstein talked about this as language games. The word games is a little strange. Philosophers like to use strange words. But his point is that depending on what kind of conversation we're having, we mean something else by certain terms. Right? When someone says to a baby, I want to eat you all up, you don't call the police because the grandpa's a cannibal. Right? It means that, but it doesn't mean that. We'll talk a lot more about this as we get later on in a different one about relationship religiosity. But for now, it's important to remember when we mean truth, it depends on what we mean by truth. So often, what happens is we're thinking of scientific truth, factual scientific truth. So, for example, if someone were to claim to me that they could go to my diesel car and instead of putting diesel gas, they could pour orange juice in there and it will drive, that is a factual claim that can be tested. And when they pour the orange juice in the car and it doesn't go anywhere and the car dies and I need to get it pumped out and I sue them, we all realize that that was not true. However, that is not the only kind of truth that there is. There are other kinds of deep spiritual truths. Right? So someone can feel the presence of God. That may not be a scientific or factual claim as much as a depiction of how they're experiencing the world. So now, when we turn to religion, we have to ask ourselves, when it's making claims about things, what type of claims is it making and how do we understand it? And here we get into something I think is very important and in our world very tricky. In the ancient world, the difference between science and philosophy and religion and history and all, it was often very mushy. Right? There wasn't as sharp a divide, clear methodological differences, what we're looking for. Now, let me just give an example. Creation. In the Torah, right, in the Pentateuch, there are two creation stories back to back. The first creation story is about how God sees the world and says, let there be light, let there be this, let there be that, let divide it up. And it goes in 6 days of creation. At the end of the sixth day, God has created humanity. Then God rests, and that's the Sabbath day, the end. Then there's another story where God wants a garden, but there's nobody to tend the garden, and there's no water to make plants grow. So God brings water, and he makes rivers, and then he creates Adam, or really it just means the man, the human, originally in biblical Hebrew. Right, it only turns into a personal name later. And he creates the man. He sees the man as lonely. He creates animals. That doesn't help. He creates a woman. That is a man and a woman. And they tend the garden. The garden has a lot of fruit. And we all know that they eat from the special fruit and then get kicked out of the garden. That's another creation story. First of all, that creation story is different than the first creation story. Because the first creation story, the order is even different. It starts with creating the world as we know it, right? So dividing up water and land. And then on the third day, after God creates land, there's already plants, even though there's no one tending it. And there's already water all the way to the beginning. And then God peoples everything. So in the sky, there are stars, because they believed stars were alive. Stars including planets and the sun and the moon. Then fish, birds, animals, and last, humans. Man and woman together at the same time. So even on a biblical level, you can already say, well, which one is true? Which one is... Now, that's a scientific question if you ask that, meaning if you're asking which one happened, which one is the one that the world developed in, either A or B or neither, right? Those are the options. Or if you want to get creative fundamentals, you could try to make a way for 1 and 2 to work together by special casing or interpreting this verse differently, that verse differently. That obviously shows a certain amount of bias that you want everything in the Bible to be somehow factually true, so you're willing to stretch the meaning of it. But if we were to ask the question, well, which one is true, A or B or neither? And we look at science, modern science, The answer would be obvious. Well, neither. This doesn't make any sense. Neither of these things go with the paleontological record. Neither of these things make sense with how we understand things, like the idea of trees before God creates the sun. I mean, the idea of creating the earth before God creates the sun is essentially absurd when we understand our solar system, that the sun is the core of it and the earth goes around. It does not make sense. Or that God just wants a garden and there's just a human and fruit trees. Right? This just is, that's the humans are part of an animal kingdom, which is a complex group of beings that are it just doesn't make neither things make sense. If you're going to say, look, here are options, and obviously I'm shrinking it a lot. Either the scientific model of that the Earth coalesces around the sun and then life begins to evolve, etc., or 6 days, seventh day God rests model, or God wants a garden model. Which one is true? The answer is, well, the most likely true is the scientific one, and the biblical ones are not likely at all. So, in that sense, it's very stressful. You say, oh, so it's not true, so we should drop it. And here's the thing, if you need religion to be factually, scientifically true, and I'm only using creation, but you could do flood. There's lots of things we could do. We'll do them later. But if you need it to be scientifically true, you come up against a big problem. It is highly, highly unlikely to the point of absurd. However, if we say, no, the stories are true, both are true. Actually, both the biblical stories are true, but not as scientific truth. Humans, when they want to understand their environment, they tell stories about their environment. So, I remember once I was reading my fifth child, third daughter, Rudyard Kipling's Just So stories. They're very fun if you haven't read them. And when I was talking about it, she said, wait a second. What about that Just So story in Hebrew that we read together on Shabbat, on the Sabbath? And I said, what? What Just So story? She's like, with the talking snake and stuff. And, like the man getting punished. I said, do you mean Bereshit, Genesis? Like the Torah, the Bible? It's like, yeah, that one. Did Rudyard Kipling write that too? I said, no. I'm quite certain Rudyard Kipling did not write that story. But the connection is very clear to me once she said it. Let's just take the second one, right? The Garden of Eden story. Now, it ends with punishments. So a snake gets punished for tempting the woman, so the snake loses its legs and it becomes the enemy of humanity. Adam gets punished. He has to work hard, right? It's hard to grow things. The sweat of his brow, literally the Bible, the Hebrew, it says the sweat of his nose. He has to get bread by sweat of his nose. I always remember it because I can remember my own grandfather, who was a very hands-on guy, and he always had that sweat dripping off his nose, so it felt very biblical. And the woman has the childbirth and pain. Now, the punchline of the story seems to be trying to explain, why is the world how it is? Now, they do it by envisioning a counterfactual. Once upon a time, the world was not this way. But the snake abused his ability to talk, or his more human form, or whatever it was he had that made him able to fool them. Adam used to have an easy time. They could just pluck fruit. Now they don't pluck. Now they can't just pluck fruit. The woman maybe was I don't know if childbirth was going to be easier, or they were going to live forever and not have to have children. I don't know exactly what it's envisioning, but the point is, once upon a time, they're saying it wasn't like that. And what the story is trying to do is come up with some meaning to the suffering, right? The meaning of the suffering is that we live in an imperfect world. We'd love to live in a perfect world. We'd love to merit living in a perfect world. So what we have to do is try to make the world better. Because right now, what the world is a consequence of, we say this, of our lack of merit, right? That's by talking about that, we're envisioning this past, this mythic past, and a time we lived in a garden and everything was simple. And it is motivational. It is also a very important psychological human need to admit that this is hard. Life is hard. Yes, we can imagine why did God? These are trying to deal with big questions like, if there's a God, why would God create a world that's so hard? Lots of different biblical books deal with that problem. So the story is very meaningful, like literature is meaningful, like myth is meaningful, like songs can be meaningful, like poetry can be meaningful, right? It's a way of trying to grapple with the world as it is, so we can tell the story. We say, look, we're not competing with the scientific model. The scientific model is trying to explain factually how things develop and trying to understand laws of science, etc., etc. But the biblical mythic stories are there to help us grapple with the world as it is. It's a kind of just so story, but unlike Rudyard Kipling, it's not meant to just be fun. Maybe the loss of the snake legs is a little bit fun, but the other, it's really trying to help us, give us language to talk about this. So in that sense, the story is very true, very impactful, and very meaningful. Once we drop the idea of making it competitive with scientific truth.